Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and what has happened here in Canada? Well, Prime Minister Mark Carney has not wasted time in rolling out announcement after announcement after announcement since he's won his majority. It is a slim majority, and since then, every week we're hearing announcements of what Ottawa wants to do and how it wants to invest. And more critically, now at a time where we're hearing what's happening in Alberta, we're bringing the latest on the separatist movement that's taking place in Alberta. But essentially today, the Prime Minister unveiled one of the largest infrastructure visions he has for Canada. Essentially a plan to double Canada's electricity grid by 2050. I know 2050 feels like it's a long time away, but time is flying by. And essentially the target for 2050 is that the Prime Minister is saying that the demand will surge, right? We see that already for AI, for electrical vehicles, even though we have the latest update on Honda, but things will shift eventually. And what, he calls industrial expansion and really Canada's security in energy concerns, right? To make sure that Canada is not exposed to the global markets the way we see, this conflict with Iran, affect the gas prices here in Eastern Canada, right? Essentially, Eastern Canada exposed to the global markets because Eastern Canada imports oil from Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or Nigeria, and Canadian oil gets exported to the United States that consumes 90% of Canadian oil. So that there is that entire discrepancy of, why isn't Canada more independent on its own natural resources, on its own infrastructure? Why is it so integrated with the United States? And as we've seen with the relationship with the United States, first term, right? And then you have the first term NAFTA was, first term of President Trump I'm referring to, NAFTA was gone and Kuzma came in. And if you recall, then, Minister Chrystia Freeland rushed from, her trip in Europe to show up to Washington, D.C. to be part of those negotiations because, the United States was talking to Mexico, not talking to Canada. And then they signed the Kuzma. And then you had, the second term for President Trump saying, hey, this is a bad deal, even though he signed the deal. And then tariffs after tariffs after tariffs, started taking place. And we've seen, a lot of shakeup happen in manufacturing hubs like Ontario and, a lot of these border cities as well. So now, and I guess Prime Minister Mark Carney, who was, a civilian, an independent person in the corporate world, essentially he launched his career in politics and became a politician as the time changed because of President Trump and, questioning Canada's sovereignty and the pressure, the economic pressure. And it gave rise to this current day. And so now we're hearing this Prime Minister really talk about, securing Canada's future, and especially when it comes to making Canada energy sovereign. And so today's announcement, where the Prime Minister says that this strategy, he says, could lower energy costs for most Canadian households and transform the country into what he calls a clean energy superpower. He said that this would cost more than $1 trillion and will require massive expansions of nuclear power, transmission systems, and skilled labor, Canadian skilled trades, and even continue to use natural gas to maintain the grid's reliability. That's him in his announcement today. It was just a couple of hours ago. So, this is big plan. Ottawa saying, hey, we're going to do this massive thing where we're going to double Canada's electricity grids by 2050. And so what is this strategy? It's aiming at doubling, Canada's electricity grid, but also what he talks about lowering energy costs and preparing Canada for AI growth, for electric vehicles, for industrial expansion and energy security challenges that Canada would face given, its current framework and infrastructure that is very interconnected with the United States. And to this, the aim is also to modernize the transmission lines and connect provincial grids. So currently you have, the provincial grids going to the United States, the states, and then before it's connected to its own province. We saw that to be the case when it came to trade, right? Where it was harder to trade from, Ontario to British Columbia. We know that this is a big country, right? How many time zones do we have? I think we have a difference of about, I think it's 7 hours coast to coast, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to double check that. But we have so many different time zones, and that also means that we have different agriculture throughout the country. We have different landscapes to the country. We have, the Rockies and, the mountains in western part of Canada. And we have, if you go through, Saskatchewan, you see wheat fields, endless wheat fields. And then you come to Ontario, it's completely different when it comes to agriculture and what each province is known for when it comes to their strengths, right? There's nothing like Ontario wines, for example, with what Niagara does and the produce. There's nothing like some of these different what provinces do, but trade has always been an issue. And to that, of course, those trade barriers were removed for interprovincial trade. Before, it was easy to just trade with the United States and not with Canada with itself. Same thing comes to when it comes to these electricity grids. And so this prime minister is saying that they want to massively increase electricity production nationwide for Canada because of this drive on AI data centers. You need it, right? And industrial electrification, which is what really powers this AI data centers and this race to super intelligence. He also talked about how it's critical for defense manufacturing and if Canada has plans to, grow its population, then it's going to be a critical aspect to make sure electricity needs are met. And to that, there's always the addition to clean energy transition policies, right? So this is part of that. So here are some of the key stats that this prime minister provided on this announcement today is that Ottawa says that the strategy could lower total energy costs for 7 in 10 Canadian households by 2050, saying that energy savings essentially will go up to $15 billion by 2050. When it comes to the workforce, well, Canada will need 130,000 skilled workers to build out this expanded grid. So if you're wondering in Canada, like, work-wise in terms of what industries are booming, well, we have the skilled labor because of infrastructure spending that this government is doing. Now it's the 130,000 skilled workers for this electricity grids. Then there is massive spending that's happening in the defense sector. So there you have about, estimations of another 120,000 jobs. So this is really where, it's about taking stock of what is the federal government going to spend on, where is it boosting its entire of these projects and boosting it with dollars. And then in those industries is where these jobs are going to pop up. Right now, what's really moving Canada's economy forward is all this government spending, weaker on the private sector. But to that point, it's about looking at what this means for, in this case, is 130,000 skilled workers for this expanded grid. And another thing that this prime minister pointed out was natural gas. And so coming back to what's taking place here in Canada with this big announcement by Prime Minister Mark Carney, essentially one major surprise in this $1 trillion investment in doubling Canada's electricity grid is that natural gas is still included, essentially showing that this prime minister is softening clean electricity rules. This government, under his leadership, is essentially saying that natural gas generation still plays a role. And this is not what we used to hear about, when he was a private citizen on, climate change and, green energy. Here, this government's becoming a little bit more realistic that, yeah, you still need natural gas. It's a big part, still plays a role when it comes to maintaining reliability, prevent shortages, as well as keeping prices affordable. So, in this case, Ottawa plans to adjust clean electricity regulations and allow more flexibility for gas-powered systems and permit certain carbon offsetting. So this is going to be reflected on what would be this government becoming more realist about energy security. You can't, deny what's happening globally and our dependence on it when it comes to oil and gas sector. And so this is also affecting when it comes to grid reliability and, of course, this entire demand when it's, when it has to do with AI driven electricity. So now, what this prime minister essentially pointed out was these four main pillars on what it means to double generation capacity. So, saying that essentially there's going to be massive expansions in hydro, nuclear, wind, solar, storage, and transmission. And Canada, he stressed that needs to connect east, west, and north, which is very good to hear because Ottawa says they want to have stronger interprovincial transmission systems to reduce this fragmentation, outages, and what would be duplicate infrastructure, when it comes to the United States, then in Canada, and then back and forth. So this is, part of the strategy of, making sure Canada is sovereign in this sense and building out a workforce, right? So this will require major expansion of skilled trades, engineering, grid construction, and energy sector training, which is critical to that 130,000 jobs that this investment from Ottawa will create, and domestic manufacturing because Canada wants more, transformers, batteries, grid equipment, and energy technologies built domestically and not something that needs to be outsourced from other countries. When it comes to nuclear power expansion, this strategy also reinforces Canada's nuclear expansion plans. We know in Ontario alone, Ontario is going to have soon to be one of the biggest nuclear power plants, bigger than, other countries in Japan and elsewhere. So Canada's nuclear expansion plans are serious, where projects, mentioned, this specific one is in Darlington, new nuclear in Ontario. Alberta nuclear strategy discussions are also on the table, and broader SMR development. So this is massive shift for this Liberal government, now led by a different leader. And, when it comes to the remote north, right, our northern territories in Canada, there's still current day challenges, right? So the government is now acknowledging that, yes, many of these northern communities, including in Nunavut, still rely heavily on diesel power generation. So that's a critical aspect. And so Ottawa is now saying that northern electrification and transmissions is one of their key goals. And to that, I think the territories are looking forward to this massive announcement and investment. So, what is driving this massive, spending of $1 trillion? Well, it's this AI, right? We keep talking about AI, but in this case, it's about, we know that AI is now reshaping national infrastructure policy. This summit in China, we know that's becoming part of this geopolitical conversation. And now it depends on national sovereignty, national security, national infrastructure policy. So these data centers that are required to do that, well, they require a lot of electricity, right? It's a big electricity load. We've seen the data centers in the United States, they take up 6% of the electricity in those cities and towns that they're in, and which is why there's been a massive pushback from residents of towns that have big data centers being built by the likes of Facebook and Google and all these other big tech companies. And then so these AI data centers, not only do they need, they use enormous electricity load, but they also need constant cooling, right? They also need a reliable high capacity grids. And so this is some of what this prime minister was talking about today. And then when you zoom out and you look at the geopolitical situation, Prime Minister Mark Carney is now framing electricity as economic sovereignty and national security because of its trade tensions with the United States. Kuzma reviews just on July 1st, a few weeks away. And this is something to be mindful of if Canada wants to be economically sovereign and have its national security, and also what we've seen in the instability created by this war now conflict between US, Israel, and Iran, and the choke points of the Strait of Hormuz that supply 20% of the world's oil. So you have that, and of course you have this global energy competition that's taking place. You have two big world leaders, China and the United States, right now in a summit talking, making deals. And so Canada is looking at, how can it stay competitive in this environment where all the other nations are, going ahead and not really waiting for the next nation. And so, what is Canada's strategy? And so this is part of what was announced today in terms of energy, AI infrastructure, manufacturing, and creating jobs, and of course, a strategic national asset on this. Of course, we're going to bring you reviews of what this big announcement means, and really big announcements come out of governments, whether it's Ottawa or Ontario or the local provinces. But then it's about doing an analysis of what are the likelihoods? How soon can we see some of this? And this 130,000 jobs, how many jobs are we talking about year to year starts? And so those are all critical things. Now, we've been covering what's been going on in Alberta. You cannot ignore this separatist movement that has been growing in Alberta, I would say probably in the last decade, and really took momentum this year with 301,000 signatures. And there you have a picture of this movement, the separatist movement, and the crowds that are coming through. So for Alberta, essentially, you need 178,000 signatures to, be verified and for it to, trigger a referendum. And that referendum would be in October. And their premier, Danielle Smith, essentially has come to power by talking about how Alberta's strong and how Alberta needs to fight for its rights. And she would definitely look at a referendum and hosting one if the signature requirements were met. Well, 301,000 signatures were submitted, well above the 178,000 that are required. And then it got stuck in court, right, to be able to verify it because there was a challenge on it. That's one issue. The second issue was about the data breach that took place while this petition was taking place, and for some of these, like Centurion, to be able to get some of these signatures. Well, there was a data leak by that Elections Alberta said, it didn't come from their system, but essentially the list of voters, we're talking about shy of 3 million, were leaked and were online. And to that, if you recall, we covered how former Premier Jason Kenney said he might take legal actions because his address and all that stuff was posted online. And so this massive leak that is now, that's another story that is integrated into this as a fallout. But the latest story now is that this separatist movement and the referendum that it was looking to get for October is now thrown out of Alberta courts. So this is because there was a challenge by First Nations group at the provincial hearing, where the provincial judge tossed it out, the petition that was submitted, saying that essentially Alberta's separation from Canada, which would have been triggered as a referendum, and if it got the right number of votes, would be, in direct violation of the treaty rights of Canada's constitution. Essentially, this First Nations group, the Stuttgart Lake Cree Nation, argued that this referendum would violate their treaty rights, and saying that, therefore it's a massive challenge that Alberta cannot actually decide to separate from the rest of Canada. And so therefore this provincial judge threw out this petition. And so what, even though this took place, we have the separatist movement saying that they're going to challenge this, right? Because they followed in terms of, how many voters signed on, and then those voter lists needs to, of course, the petition, the 300,000 signatures need to be verified that they are Albertan voters, and then that would trigger this referendum. Even though it's been kicked out of provincial court, they're going to do, a follow-up and appeal it, but this premier that you see a video of standing next to the Prime Minister, Danielle Smith, essentially she has said she would put Alberta independence question on the ballot this fall if the necessary signatures were collected. And to this case, the necessary signatures were collected, right? Well over the 178,000 required. And so to this point, we'll see what this premier is going to do. We know there's going to be a big announcement made tomorrow with the Prime Minister Mark Carney and Premier Danielle Smith, but and it'd be very hard for her to ignore this movement that is growing significantly, and the signature requirements were met. So we'll see what she decides to do, whether this will trigger a vote for a referendum, and how she's going to navigate the expectations that Albertans have on her. Now, so tomorrow, we're going to hear this big announcement to which Prime Minister Mark Carney alluded to today in his press conference when he announced doubling Canada's electricity grids. But essentially, Ottawa and Alberta have struck a deal on industrial carbon pricing. And this comes at a time where Alberta, essentially agreed to raising its fee for industrial polluters from the current rate of $95 per ton of carbon emitting to $130 per ton by 2040. Now, Mark Carney, Prime Minister, he did, reportedly that he did present this deal to his cabinet yesterday, and is expected to fly over to Alberta to meet the Premier, Danielle Smith, and make this massive announcement. Alberta's carbon pricing is regulated at a provincial level. So this was something that was rolled out, right? The provinces should have their own scheme. And in the case they refuse to, then the federal scheme would kick in. So in Alberta, they have their carbon pricing. It's regulated at the provincial level. So, under Premier Danielle Smith, but must comply with federal standards. So this rate that they've agreed to at 130 per ton, $130 per ton by 2040 is less than the original $170 per ton that was supposed to be met by 2030. So not only did they push it out for another decade to 2040, but it's no longer $170 per ton. It's now $130 per ton. So this is something that she's going to, show Albertans like, hey, we did a deal, and that means that we're going to be able to expand our pipelines. It means we're going to be able to go to work and, have job creation and a strong Alberta economy. Now, is that enough to slow down the separatist movement and the full steam ahead that they've been on, and of course the setback that they just had with the court ruling? That's to be seen. Of course, we're going to watch this very carefully and bring it to you minute by minute if any of this changes. But just the background on this for their announcement tomorrow is that there was a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, that was signed between Ottawa and Alberta. It was signed just last fall, and it was to build new oil pipelines to British Columbia. And then, of course, it included commitments on the province to cut emissions and, and raise their pricing, and to that there was the back and forth of, we can't go with $170 per ton by 2030, and now this negotiation has been met at $130 per ton by 2040. Now that is going to grow over time, so we'll see how Albertans feel about this big announcement. We're going to watch the reactions throughout the weekend. Of course, we're going to bring you the latest on what's happening on the ground there. But, these details have been going back and forth, but it really has to do with pipelines, right? The routes to make sure that they're built, they get out to market over the Pacific Ocean to Pacific Asia, to be able to make sure that Canada has more than one customer, right? I mean, you can't change the fact that Canada's biggest customer is the United States, and it buys Canadian crude oil below market rate, refines it, and sells it in the market at market rate. So they make the revenue. Obviously, they make profit in taking Canadian oil cheap because the pipeline goes directly from Alberta down to the United States. They refine it and they sell in the market, and that's Canadian oil. That's not Canada doing it. That's not Canada refining and selling in the marketplace, given 90% of it goes to the United States, right? Even though Canada's shown a surplus in the past little while when it comes to its energy sector because of what's been going on in the world with the energy markets. But at the end of the day, can you imagine, just selling your natural resources that your country can't even use east to west corridor, right? From Alberta all the way to New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and all those provinces, and of course, biggest consumers here in Ontario as the largest population in Canada, second to Quebec. Quebec being second to Ontario is what I meant. So if you can imagine that, and that oil goes to the United States below market rate, so at a discounted rate, and then the United States, refines and sells it in the market. And that's why the president says, we don't need oil. We have tons of oil. 90% of Canadian oil they have, yes. So this is what, is really at play. And I think the more we know about some of these deals that were done so long ago and some of this infrastructure that was built so long ago has created what the situation Canada's in today when it comes in its massive dependence on America. So it's very interesting to see what this government is planning to do to make Canada less dependent. So now when you look at what it was still the Liberal government, right? This Liberal government has been in power since 2015. Now, what I could talk about is the Carney Liberal government versus the Trudeau Liberal government. So the Carney Liberal government has, not hesitated in slashing this Trudeau government era environmental regulations that essentially created the momentum of the separatist movement in Alberta. When it was all this anti-oil regulations, Alberta's like, well, our biggest economy is oil and gas, and Alberta went into a recession. And so can you imagine? And that started saying, hey, why are we letting Ottawa decide what should and should not be our regulations? We have, a natural resource, we have skilled workers, we have infrastructure, we have our economy to defend, and for that sake, then maybe if Alberta was a separate, sovereign, independent state, then we don't have to listen to Ottawa, which is what has been driving this momentum when you see those crowds of Albertans rallying for the separatists, this separation from Canada. So now you see this Liberal government saying, okay, let's backtrack from Trudeau era, anti-pipelines, anti-oil regulations, and let's start looking at the reality of Canada as a whole, and not being, what Alberta said was, Ottawa is blind, deaf, and mute to Alberta's needs, which has created the political situation that we're seeing there right now. So now what we're seeing is we are seeing this entire shift. But of course, carbon tax, which was axed by this prime minister, really taking, if you recall, Pierre Poilievre's majority of his campaign platform prior to this general election we had last year. Pierre Poilievre, the Conservatives, had this axe the carbon tax and all of that. And Mark Carney came and said, oh, it seems to be trending really well with Canadians. Let's do it. And we've seen Prime Minister Mark Carney really take a lot of conservative, ideas, conservative platform ideas, and all of that, and especially this cutting the 10 cents on gas excise tax was a conservative thing that was pushed out. So this prime minister is not shy to be liberal when it comes to some of this carbon, this offsetting plan that he's putting in place with Alberta, but also saying, hey, I'm going to be pro pipelines, and I'm going to be axe the carbon tax and everything else in between. So it's very interesting times to see this sort of liberal leader really center himself, and perhaps it's been part of why he's had so many MPs cross the floor, whether it was, for their own sake or for their party's sake. I mean, sorry, their constituents' sake, not their party's sake, because they're crossing party boundaries. But it's very interesting times of how much of these policies are changing, and then what it means for the previously existing Liberal MPs under Trudeau, who came into power under Trudeau and pushed out some of this legislation, and how they're saying something else today. But hey, it's kept them in power, and it is what it is. Now I want to talk about Honda dealership and Honda plans for, this EV, electrical vehicle battery manufacturing project in Ontario. This was supposed to be, the future, right? This was a big announcement by then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Premier Doug Ford. This was supposed to be this $15 billion electric vehicle battery manufacturing project in Ontario is now indefinitely suspended. And that is a massive setback to Canada's EV ambitions, essentially, because Honda is saying, hey, we got to shift away from our EV plans to what we used to have, which was essentially a hybrid model, right? A car being able to have the capabilities of having the advantages of what an electrical vehicle would be, but also using but also having gas and using less of it and being able to power itself. So this hybrid vehicle, which we've had around for 20 years or so, it's shifting back to that model. Now, why did this happen? Well, in North America, there was supposed to be a demand for electric vehicles. There was regulations, set by provinces, the federal government, set by European Union, and everybody was signing on to EVs, right, for climate change reasons. And since President Trump got back into office for a second term, essentially he scrapped that. He said it's not needed, right? Drill baby drill. American auto companies need to just create cars that rely on oil and gas, and that's what we're going to do. And that, of course, led China in terms of taking 56% of the EV market share, which is why Elon Musk is there today to see, hey, what's going on, with all these different EV brands out in China, and to see why they're doing so well. But when it comes to Canada, this project that was supposed to be in Alliston in Ontario is now not going to happen, and that's done. It's shut down. This was projected to be a $15 billion project. And to that, you had the federal government, along with the provincial government, fund, $5 billion worth. And that was a big announcement that was made back in 2024 because it was supposed to be a major EV assembly plant and really put Canada, more specifically Ontario, on the map as the engine of EVs and battery manufacturing facilities, and really compete in the marketplace, right, internationally. And it was supposed to churn out a 250 million vehicles annually and create 1,000 new manufacturing jobs. All of that is scrapped and completely gone. Honda is pulling back, saying they're suspending the entire thing. I don't think they're giving back the money, though. I mean, that's, they did take federal funding in that. And they're saying that essentially they're pulling back because there's changing market conditions and there is a weakening of electrical vehicle demand. And so they're doing a revision of their corporate strategy of what to push forward. And to that, and shy of EV vehicles, electrical vehicles, they're saying, hey, here's the hybrid. It's tried, tested, and true. And that's what we're going to, turn out. And this is, gasoline, electric, hybrid vehicles, right? That still seem to be strong expectations and demand in the market and shy of full EVs. So this is, Trump era policies, right? Weakening US's EV demand, rolling back on EV subsidies that were in place in states and provinces and also federally. Then there's tariff uncertainty of what it means for these vehicles. And of course, the looser what we're seeing in terms of infrastructure spending. Can it support electrical vehicles? And what it means about, the aggressive plans for the other automobile companies, in the United States, and how they're pushing forward for what their projections are. So this is why there was a pushback and the rollback on EV incentives that were tied really to, on some of this push to have this demand. Now, the demand will probably come back, right? I mean, Trump is in office for another 2.5 years, based on who's going to take office next. And if it's going to be Democrats who are going to come back, they'll probably start having some of these policies back in place. It might shift things for some of these companies. But for now, Honda is saying they're facing massive problems because of all the investment, all the planning at a corporate level that went towards EVs was scrapped overnight. And to that, the company, Honda, had its first annual loss since becoming a public company in the 1950s. So when it comes to reported loss, they had about $2.7 billion, that's USD, in losses. And the company has admitted that the EV competitiveness it can't compete with now the likes of what China's doing with BYD and other brands. There's the upfront costs. You have Chinese EVs that are a fraction of the price as the American EVs. And of course, lower than expected adoption of EVs, which is hurting their profitability. EVs are great for city driving, right? But if you're going to do long distance, especially like, for example, in Canada or even the United States, you're not going to have that level of infrastructure to be able to charge your car, your electrical vehicle. And that's why you rely on a gas vehicle, or in this case, a hybrid, to be able to do that. But in terms of like a city, that's fine. But as soon as you go out to the city day-to-day driving and you go for long driving and long, trips, it's very hard to be able to sustain that. So, that means Canada's EV strategy is essentially, being downsized. I don't think it's fully canceled, but it's definitely delayed, and we'll see what changes over the next little while, right? In terms of the impact it's going to have on the economy. Also, new research is suggesting that Canadians have also dramatically reduced our travel to the United States. We knew that was coming when we started hearing about, Canada becoming the 51st state, and Canadians did not take kindly to that. And of course, the tariffs that put a lot of Canadians out of jobs and their, and their security. So now we're seeing less travel. And that actually comes from researchers at the University of Toronto found that the visits to major U.S. metropolitan areas, do you remember back in the day, it was going over to Buffalo, whether it was shopping in Buffalo or going over to Windsor, and this cross-border in and out, and that's just in Ontario, let alone, from the whole BC over to the United States with Seattle, Washington, and BC, and they're crossing back and forth, and all the other provinces that have entryway into the United States. But now University of Toronto found that visitors to major US metropolitan areas dropped roughly 42% over the last 2 years. And this is because of the growing tensions between, the two countries. Well, not Americans, but on President Trump because of tariffs, immigration enforcement, and essentially, President Trump's rhetoric on 51st State and Governor Trudeau, or all the things he was saying. He hasn't said it lately, but this impacted tourism, business travel, and the biggest fallout of that is these border communities are feeling the strain. Right before, like, you'd have somebody living across the border coming in for a job, whether it was in healthcare or whatever the case is, and there's about what is that, $3.5 billion that trade in goods and services daily across this border. So yeah. And so now Canadians have dramatically cut their travel to the United States. It's Canadians that went to Vegas. It's Canadians that went to some of these places that are now saying, these cities are really doing ads and saying, Canadians, we miss you, come back. And Canadians are like, well, why are we going to spend our Canadian dollars in your economy? First, the Canadian dollar is hurting. And so we're going to spend it here in Canada, and we're not going to be exposed to, the USD rates and spend it in your economy. And more so, let's see what happens this summer. Are Canadians going to stay here in Canada? I mean, really, are they going to go to Europe? We saw the trend pick up to go to Europe last year, but we know fuel prices are through the roof. We know Europe's having its own challenges with jet fuel and canceling flights. So really, why would a Canadian want to go get stuck in Europe and spend euros when, we have abundance of fresh lake water. We have abundance of places that are absolutely untapped in this country that, when it comes to tourism, when it comes to all of that. So it'll be very interesting to see where Canadians spend their holidays this summer, and keep the dollars in, like, go and support these small towns in Ontario, for example, that have beachfronts and have restaurants and smaller hotels and local businesses. That's where, if we're going to spend Canadian dollars to take our families on vacation, even if it's a short weekend vacation or maybe a longer one, then it's good to be able to invest it back into Canadian businesses and the Canadian economy. And we've had more flights from Canadians going to the United States or the Caribbean than Canada going east to west. And so if it doesn't make sense to go, let's just say, to Vancouver, or as far west to Alberta or Vancouver, then or east to Nova Scotia and the rest, at least staying local on road trips is a great idea, and that's something that I'll be doing this summer as well. But going back to these numbers, you have 42% decline of Canadians visiting U.S. Major metropolitan areas. That is from a timeline of April 2024 to March 2026. So this entire March break as well, Canadians not visiting the United States, even for a road trip. And the official border data is showing that roughly 25% decline. So that is the border data coming out. And some of these things that took place between what President Trump said to Canadians has definitely hurt them. And so major cities that are feeling the impact, New York. I know so many people that would just drive to New York because they have family there and spend long weekends, but they're not doing that anymore. Or Vegas, like we mentioned, or San Francisco, Houston, Florida, right? Florida, massive hub for the snowbirds, where you had Canadians go there for 6 months, who have homes there, retired Canadians. They've been quickly getting out of Florida, and Florida was great because it was just like that 1.5, 2 hour flight. And it's the same time zone as Eastern Canada, but no longer is it viable. So, the Florida tourism. And so this is obviously impacting the local economies. And they're saying that, it is what it is. And there's a strong economic ties, obviously, Ontario has with the auto sector and its neighbors in Michigan, and even at that, or Grand Rapids, and even at that, with the slowdown of what's taken place in Ontario manufacturing, and that's slowed down for Canadians wanting to cross the border. So this has also impacted business travel. It's slowed down because of financing, of course, technology, manufacturing, trade. Overall, there is weaker Canadian business activity happening in the United States, and this tension has been growing. So, what are Canadians doing? We saw in the last from this time frame from 2024 of April till March, they saw that there was obviously, without Canadians going just across the border, obviously there's weaker retail activity because they're not spending their money in the retail stores in America. There's fewer hotel bookings because all those hotels that really service this cross-border travelers, as well as declining tourism in general. So Canadians were seen in this past year going to Mexico instead, or to Europe, or just staying home. And I think now it's about, let's stay home, and like, what are the challenges going on in Europe? Nobody wants to go and get stuck there with their entire energy crisis that they're experiencing with this conflict with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. So this is definitely having big political backlash, right? Because CUSMA review is just around the corner, and perhaps the American counterparts will take some of this into consideration to see, hey, we're missing our Canadian tourism dollars and how it's impacting them. Well, that's all the time we have for today on Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh. Until tomorrow, take care and be well.